Testing, testing, 1, 2.
Testing, testing, 1.
The subcommittee will come to order. After recognizing myself and Ranking Member Deutsch for 5 minutes each for our opening statements, I will then recognize other members seeking recognition for 1 minute or longer. We will then hear from our witnesses, and without objection, witnesses, your prepared statements will be made a part of the record, and members may have 5 days in which to insert statements and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. The chair now recognizes herself for 5 minutes. In the nearly 2 years since the United Nations Security Council adopted Resolution 2231, approving the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, and lifting sanctions on Iran, one thing has been abundantly clear: the notion that Iran would now modify its behavior and become a responsible member of the international community has proven to be completely and utterly false. Many of us knew that the Iranian regime would not moderate its behavior, but that it would amplify its illicit activity using the nuclear deal as leverage. And sure enough, since the JCPOA was signed, we have seen an Iran that has taken U.S. citizens hostages and demanded, and unfortunately received, ransom for their return. As a result, Iran has since held additional U.S. citizens and permanent U.S. residents with the expectation of receiving more ransom payments. The regime continues to support the Assad regime with money, with supplies, with weapons, with fighters, and is doing the same in Yemen with the Houthis. Iran's ships have made dozens of provocative actions toward U.S. ships in the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf, with the regime playing a dangerous game and harassing our vessels. And of course, Iran continues to support terror around the world, most notably through its support of the terror group Hezbollah. This has allowed Hezbollah to increase its stockpile of rockets and missiles to 150,000 or more, and add more sophisticated missiles to its arsenal, putting our friend and ally, the Democratic Jewish State of Israel, under greater threat. All of these activities have seen an uptick since the JCPOA, and all are indeed very troubling. But perhaps the most egregious and troubling is Iran's continued pursuit of a viable ballistic missile program. Why? Because history has shown us, and as one witness before this panel previously stated, that nuclear weapons and ballistic missile programs go hand in glove. Over time, the correlation between a country's nuclear program and a corresponding ballistic missile program has proved to be absolute. That countries that sustain indigenous medium and long-range ballistic missiles always aspire to possess nuclear weapons. Since the signing of the JCPOA, Iran has tested, according to some sources, at least 15 ballistic missiles, and it has done so in open defiance of Resolution 2231. It came as a shock to so many of us that a final concession to Iran was given when the U.S. agreed to lift the arms embargo as part of the nuclear deal, especially when we were told repeatedly that the deal was only on the nuclear program. That is why the Trump administration needs to follow through on some of its promises and reevaluate this JCPOA and the 2231 resolution. We are seeing an uptick in these ballistic missile tests and Iran's aspiration for an ICBM program precisely because the regime wants to be ready to be able to deliver a nuclear payload when the terms of the JCPOA expire, and we will have walked them right into it. We simply cannot allow the regime to continue with these provocations. We need to go back to the Security Council and find a way to make sure that there can be no ambiguity. Any ballistic missile testing, any attempt to acquire ballistic missile technology or expertise, and any attempt to proliferate from the regime must be stopped and sanctioned. The original intent of the nuclear sanctions was to put so much pressure on the regime that it would be forced to end all enrichment and completely dismantle its nuclear program and infrastructure. That needs to be our approach on the regime's missile program, while also revisiting the JCPOA and all of its flaws. We already have important tools for the president to use now, like the Iran, North Korea, and Syria Non-Proliferation Act. Sadly, as this subcommittee learned last Congress, the State Department and the previous administration sat on these important reports and sanctions, oftentimes for years, in order to not upset the regime during these sensitive negotiations. The latest round of sanctions on March 21st is a good step, but this report came 9 months after the previous report and only covered activities that took place in the years 2014, so we still have a very serious backlog. The new administration needs to step up its Iran, North Korea, and Syria non-proliferation activities, and it needs to use the other tools available to it. One tool should be Chairman Royce and Ranking Members Engel's new bill, of which I'm proud to be a co-sponsor, that specifically targets Iran's ballistic missiles. We need Iran and those that seek to supply it with the technology or know-how to know that we will bring down sanctions so crippling on them that they will have to think twice about developing its ballistic missile program. We need to fully and vigorously enforce our current sanctions and then strengthen and expand them to ensure maximum pressure is exerted, because Iran only responds to strength and pressure. And with that, I'm pleased to yield to the ranking member, Mr. Deutsch, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thanks for calling today's very timely hearing. Iran is not a new subject for the subcommittee. We've explored its nuclear program, the threat it poses to Israel, its relationships with North Korea and Hezbollah, and the realities that it hopes to exploit under the JCPOA. Today, we'll focus on Iran's non-nuclear behavior, its ballistic missile program, and its dangerous Revolutionary Guard Corps. I know that you and I share the belief that this Congress can still move resolutely against Iran's continued pursuit of ballistic missiles. I want to thank our witnesses for being here to answer our questions and help us frame our conversation, and I look forward to what I know will be a healthy exchange of ideas. With Iran, despite the nuclear deal, Iran's behavior has not changed. Now, freed from many of the sanctions that once isolated it, Iran is looking to integrate itself into the global economy and to normalize its relations with the Western countries. Unsurprisingly, this hope has been undermined by Iran's continued support for the murderous Assad regime in Syria, funding of Hezbollah in Lebanon, calls for the destruction of Israel, and insistence on sowing instability beyond its borders. In many areas of conventional military power, Iran lags far behind its neighbors. To make up for these deficiencies, Iran now has the Middle East's largest arsenal of ballistic missiles and is developing the know-how to produce increasingly complex missile components on its own. Thanks to the Russians, Iran now has the S-300 missile defense system. And in a matter of a few years, the Iranian space program claims that it will be able to create rockets that can drop a warhead anywhere in the world. It is clear that left unhindered, the scale and the sophistication of the Iranian missile program will only grow. And it is incumbent on this Congress to act decisively to halt its progress. However members may have felt about the nuclear deal, we can all agree that the JCPOA does not prevent us from responding to reckless behavior from Iran, and that UN Security Council Resolution 2231 forbids the Iranians from testing or developing ballistic missiles. Despite that resolution, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which oversees the missile program, has conducted test after test of these weapons in defiance of the will of the international community. The fact that an organization like the IRGC, which supports terrorist organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah, is also in charge of dangerous missile technologies should send a chill down the spine of anyone working for peace and stability in the Middle East. The United States has an obligation to stand against the IRGC's repeated provocations by raising the issue of missile tests in the Security Council at every opportunity. We also need to use our influence at the UN to encourage allies to do the same, even at a time when our new president seems intent on abdicating America's role as a leader in international diplomacy. In addition to robust engagement at the Security Council, we can take a number of concrete steps to box in the Iranians. First, we need to pass the bipartisan H.R. 1698, which I am proud to co-sponsor. The bill would sanction countries like Russia that sell missile technology to Iran, the financial institutions that make those sales possible, and the Iranian entities that contribute to the country's domestic missile industry. Second, we have to support full and vigorous enforcement of the JCPOA, which means ensuring that the IAEA has the resources that it needs to carry out its monitoring, and, importantly, embracing Europe's renewed interest in tightening implementation of the deal. Finally,
We should encourage GCC states to adopt a coordinated missile defense system that will act as a deterrent to Iranian aggression in the Gulf. I don't pretend that this list is exhaustive, and I'm glad we have the opportunity today to discuss all of our options. Whatever path we take, it is clear that we must act together and that we must act quickly. The danger that Iran continues to pose through its funding of terrorist organizations, its meddling in regional affairs, and its pursuit of ever more deadly ballistic missile technologies demands continued engagement from the United States and our allies. We have seen that international coordination against the threat from Iran is possible, and we know that there is strong bipartisan support in Congress for decisive action of this kind. I welcome a thoughtful discussion today about the tools that we have at our disposal, and I encourage my colleagues to remain united against Iran's violations of international law and its clear refusal to live in peace with its neighbors. And I will yield back the balance of my time. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deutsch. And now we will turn to our members for their opening statements, starting with Mr. DeSantis of Florida.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. We've been on this committee years talking about Iran, talking about the Iran deal. We were told at the time this deal would help bring Iran into the more community of nations. It would improve their behavior if we just let our boot off their neck and released all these sanctions. And that hasn't happened here. We're talking about now their belligerence, what they're doing with ballistic missiles. Go back to this deal. The Obama administration conceded at the outset on the ballistic missile issue, which was a major mistake to begin with. And we see Iran has been emboldened by this deal, their belligerent conduct throughout the Middle East in places like Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, has demonstrated that they are very much a malevolent force. And I think I join both my colleagues in supporting the need for us to move very swiftly on tough sanctions, both against Iran's ballistic missile program and against the Revolutionary Guard Corps. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. DeSantis. Mr. Boyle of Pennsylvania.
Thank you, and I'll be brief, and some of this will be a little bit repetitive from what Mr. Deutsch was saying, but essentially the intelligence community has assessed that Iran has the largest inventory of ballistic missiles in the Middle East. UN Security Council Resolution 2231 calls upon Iran, and let me quote it specifically because I think this is sometimes confused by some, quote, "not to undertake any activity related to ballistic missiles designed to be capable of delivering nuclear weapons, including launches using ballistic missiles technology," end quote. Despite that, we know now there have been some 15 illegal tests since 2331 came into force. So I look forward to this hearing and specifically discussing ways we can move forward on this matter that do not in any way conflict with the JCPOA, but live up to the letter of the law of 2331. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Boyle. Mr. Mast of Florida.
Thank you, Chairman. As we speak about this issue, I just ask that we always keep into perspective what we've allowed to become very cliche, in that we constantly point to Iran using the phrase, the largest state sponsor of terror, and ask ourselves, what does that really mean? And for those of us that have spent time on our nation's battlefields in modern history, we know exactly what that looks like. It was Iranian hands that produced improvised explosive devices that literally killed thousands of our service members in Iraq. It was Iranian-made hands that packed improvised explosive devices with nuts and screws and bolts and other pieces of shrapnel so that they would put so many holes in our service members that we couldn't plug each and every one of them before they would hemorrhage out. That's the enemy that we're dealing with. As my colleague, Mr. Deutsch, put it, the group that is sowing instability. That is how they sow that instability. And I ask that we keep that in perspective as we move forward in this dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your service. Mr. Schneider of Illinois.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I want to thank you and the ranking member for calling this very important hearing. I thank the witnesses for sharing their perspectives and insights. Iran obviously remains a significant threat in the region, around the world, to our allies and to our interests. And while a nuclear Iran is without question one of the greatest threats we could face, Iran continues to, through its ballistic missile development, through its shipment of conventional arms, through its nefarious activities, in the region, in the world, and as well as its violations of human rights, to remain a very bad actor. As the ranking member said, the JCPOA does not preclude us from taking actions to thwart Iran's ballistic missile program or to address their other nefarious actions around the world and in the region. I would take it a step further, in fact. I believe we have a moral obligation to do just that, and I look forward to having this hearing to talk about how we can push back on Iran's behavior. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. As a former FBI agent dealing with counterterrorism matters, it was often our job to find the nexus between terrorists and their state sponsors. And since the 1980s, the largest and most adept state sponsor of terrorism has been the Islamic Republic of Iran. And Americans first became aware of this somber fact back in 1983, when an Iranian-sponsored terrorist group, Hezbollah, bombed the Marine barracks in Beirut, Lebanon. Since then, Iran has continued to support groups that target Americans abroad. From 1982 to 1992, Iranian-backed Hezbollah kidnapped and held captive some 104 hostages in Lebanon, including the CIA's Beirut station chief, William Buckley. After the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, Iranian intelligence and Revolutionary Guard Corps operatives provided training, arms, IED materials to insurgents. In recent years, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, specifically the shadowy Quds Force Group, has attempted to sow continued instability throughout the Middle East. In Syria, the IRGC advisors have fought and died alongside of the forces of Bashar al-Assad. In Iraq, the commander of the Quds Force has been seen advising and assisting local Iraqi Shiite militias. Some of these militias, such as the Badr organization, have been accused of heinous human rights abuses. These militias have worsened the already heightened sectarianism between the Sunnis and Shiites in Iraq. Unfortunately, Iran's treachery has not been met with any increased sanctions or diplomatic pressure. Rather, in recent years, they've been awarded over $1 billion in frozen assets to Iran as part of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Agreement, otherwise known as the JCPOA. The JCPOA has not only upset America's Sunni Arab allies, it has also emboldened Iran. Iran still continues to test ballistic missiles and continues to sow discord and sectarianism throughout the region. While it is important to continue the fight against ISIS in Iraq and Syria, we must remain vigilant and prevent Iran from establishing a crescent of influence throughout the region. I yield back, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Chairman Ros-Lehtinen and Ranking Member Deutsch, for holding this important hearing on Iran's ballistic missile program. Without question, Iran's continued efforts to develop short-range and medium-range ballistic missiles and its ambition to develop intercontinental ballistic missiles pose a significant challenge to the United States and our allies. Development of these capabilities pose significant risks to U.S. forces and interests in the region, and it also places Israel and our allies in the Persian Gulf in danger. Iran cannot be allowed to defy international agreements and create increased uncertainty and disorder in the Middle East. At the same time, I believe it's essential that our response to Iran's defiance of international agreements not undermine the progress made under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action to curb Iran's nuclear program. It is my hope that the Trump administration will continue to work closely with our partners and allies to address the mutual challenges posed by Iran. I look forward to hearing from today's witnesses and hearing their insights on how to best respond to Iran's continued development of its ballistic missile program while ensuring that we do not move backwards in the international effort to prevent Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons. And with that, I thank the gentlelady and yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. And now we turn to Ms. Wagner of Missouri.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Last month, a senior member of the Iranian Parliament's National Security and Foreign Policy Commission warned us that the U.S. Army's Fifth Fleet in Bahrain will be, and I quote, razed to the ground if the enemy, the United States, makes a mistake. These comments are particularly threatening in light of Iran's denial of confrontations between its fast attack boats and U.S. ships in the Gulf last week. It is clear that Iran interprets reality, their own reality, however, as it chooses, and future incidents could easily end in shots fired. Iran is one of the United States' most severe security threats, and the JCPOA, or as we would call it, the Iran deal, has done little to mitigate dangerous conflict. I look forward to discussing this afternoon how we can best reduce tensions in the region and hold Iran accountable for its actions. And I thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you for an excellent statement. And now I'm pleased to introduce our witnesses this afternoon. First, we're delighted to welcome back Dr. Kenneth Katzman, who serves as the Senior Middle East Analyst for the Congressional Research Service. He is a specialist on Iran, on the Persian Gulf states, and Afghanistan. Dr. Katzman is also an expert on Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. I'm so sorry for all of my junk here. Mr. Shabbat, the IRGC, and I spread out. And he has written one of the preeminent books on the subject and is an expert on Iranian-backed groups operating in the Middle East. Prior to this, he was an analyst at the CIA. He is a foremost expert on Iran's Revolutionary Guard. We look forward once again to your testimony, Dr. Katzman. Welcome back. Next, we want to also welcome back Mr. Michael Eisenstadt. He is the director of the Military and Security Studies Program at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Prior to joining the Institute, he served for 26 years as an officer in the U.S. Army Reserve. Thank you for your service, sir, and we look forward to your testimony, Mr. Eisenstadt. Finally, we would like to welcome Elizabeth Rosenberg, Director of the Energy, Economics, and Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. She served as a senior advisor to the U.S. Department of the Treasury, to the Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes, and then to the Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. In these roles, she has worked on tightening global sanctions on Iran. Welcome to our subcommittee, Ms. Rosenberg. And as I stated in my opening statements, all of your full statements will be made a part of the record. Please feel free to synthesize. Thank you. And Dr. Katzman will begin with you while I clean up here.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Thank you, and
hold that microphone a little bit closer. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Deutsch, for inviting CRS to testify today. I'll summarize my statement. I asked that my full statement, which was cleared by the CRS review process, be included in the record. First, I'll talk a little about what are Iran's objectives in its ballistic missile program. I think it's we think it's multifaceted. Iran's longstanding national identity, Iran's ideology, a response to perceived threats, and domestic political dynamics in Iran. In terms of national prestige and pride, developing a large, sophisticated missile arsenal enhances Iran's prestige and international reputation. Ideologically, the transfer by the Quds Force, as was mentioned, the IRGC Quds Force, of shorter-range missiles and rockets to forces in the region, such as Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis in Yemen, appears to be aimed at boosting movements that share Iran's ideology, which is ultimately to overturn a power structure in the region that Iran's leaders feel was established by and serves the United States, Israel, and Saudi Arabia. Strategically, Iran's missile program can be interpreted as an equalizer to address Iran's conventional military weaknesses relative to the United States or any other regional power. Iran's supply of short-range missiles to Hezbollah, for example, gives Iran and Hezbollah the option to attack Israel. Iran's shipments to the Houthis in Yemen, which they have used on several occasions, positions Iran to project power not only in the Gulf, where it traditionally projects power, but also now on the southeast, the southern coast of the southwest, the southern coast of the Arabian Peninsula. In terms of Iranian politics, Iran's President Hassan Rouhani might perceive that because he was the architect on the Iranian side of the JCPOA, he might be vulnerable to hardline elements who might ask him, well, you've given up Iran's nuclear deterrent potential. How do you plan to defend the country? And missiles could be seen as his answer to that challenge. On the IRGC, the ballistic missile program, as was noted, is run by the IRGC Air Force. The IRGC Air Force originally was designed to become an air force, but Iran quickly learned that it was too expensive and too time-consuming to develop another air force alongside the regular air force, so they assigned the IRGC Air Force to handle Iran's ballistic missile program. The Quds Force, as was noted, is a key instrument in Iran's attempts to reshape regional politics to its advantage through these weapons transfers of cruise short-range ballistic missiles. The RGC also, because its charter is to defend the revolution, it interprets its mission as justifying its involvement in Iranian politics, which is really unique to militaries around the world. It's one of the only, I haven't studied all of the militaries in the world, but it's one of the only militaries that says it's its mission to involve itself in politics. The RGC Navy is amply supplied with cruise and coastal defense missiles, mostly purchased from outside suppliers. The RGC Navy and the regular Navy, again, two navies, RGC Navy and a regular Navy, use these missiles to try to control Iran's territorial waters. Sanctions and other options. The JCPOA imposes no restrictions on Iran's missile program. UN Security Council Resolution 2231 calls upon Iran to refrain for a maximum of 8 years from developing ballistic missiles designed to be capable of delivering nuclear weapons. And that's 8 years from October 2015. So we're now really 6.5 years till that restriction expires. There are a number of options available to the Trump administration to counter Iran's ballistic missile program. One option is additional sanctions. At their height in 2012, 2013, sanctions had significant effect on Iran's economy and clearly contributed to its acceptance of the JCPOA, yet Iran continued to expand its nuclear and missile programs. The JCPOA, the one problem is the JCPOA essentially walls off Iran's main economic sectors from new sanctions because there is language that Iran would consider it a breach if sanctions are reimposed, the ones that were lifted are reimposed, which makes it difficult, we think, to impose new proliferation-related sanctions which would not touch the main economic sectors. If you don't touch Iran's main economic sectors, it might be hard to be effective in changing Iran's calculations. Another option would be to designate the RGC as a foreign terrorist organization. It is difficult, however, to see how much additional actual pressure this would add on the RGC that is not already imposed under existing sanctions, which are extensive on the RGC. Other options could be enhancing U.S. and regional missile defense. And as far as military options, President Trump has said that all options are on the table, but he has not specified criteria or circumstances that could trigger potential U.S. military action on Iran. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Excellent testimony. Thank you, Mr. Katzman. We've been joined by Mr. Shabbat and Ms. Gabbard. So before we move to the witnesses, I wanted to see if they had an opening statement or anything that's on their mind.
Thank you for offering, but I think I'll pass it this time.
Thank you. And I know you're in judiciary that has a markup right now, Ms. Gabbard. Okay, thank you. So, Mr. Eisenstadt, you're up. It's still going on. Thank you, sir.
Chairperson Ros-Lehtinen, Ranking Member Deutsch, committee members, thank you for inviting me to address your committee today. As stated by several committee members in their opening statements, Iran has the largest missile force in the Middle East, consisting of thousands of short and medium-range ballistic missiles and possibly land attack cruise missiles. Although its missiles are conventionally armed, many could deliver a nuclear weapon if Iran were ever to acquire such a capability in violation of its NPT obligations and JCPOA commitments. While the recent nuclear accord with Iran will likely defer such a possibility, it did not impose new constraints on Iran's nuclear missile program. On the contrary, Security Council Resolution 2231, which gave international legal force to the nuclear accord, loosened them and included provisions for the lifting of these constraints in 8 years, if not sooner. Missiles and rockets are central to Iran's way of war and that of its proxies. Missiles permit quick, flexible responses during rapidly moving crises. Missile salvos can generate greater cumulative effects on enemy morale and staying power in a shorter period of time than can terrorist attacks. For these reasons, Iran's missile force are the backbone of its deterrent and warfighting capabilities. The United States and its regional partners have been investing significant resources in missile defenses in recent decades. However, the continued growth in size and accuracy of Iran's missile force raised concerns that it could saturate and overwhelm missile defenses in the Gulf and Israel. This problem will only increase with the passage of time. At current production rates, Iran's missile force could more than double in size by the time the major limits imposed by the JCPOA are lifted in the year 2030. Iran's growing missile force, in tandem with its growing offensive cyber capabilities, will enable it to target the critical infrastructure and missile defenses of our partners with a powerful one-two punch in the physical and virtual domains, while putting American military bases and forces in the region, including our carrier strike groups, at risk. An Iranian nuclear missile force would be highly destabilizing. Short missile flight times between Iran and Israel, the lack of reliable crisis communication channels, and the impossibility of knowing whether incoming Iranian missiles are conventional or nuclear could spur Israel and any other regional nuclear states that might emerge in the interim to adopt a launch-on-warning posture, undermining the prospect for a stable nuclear deterrent balance in the region. So what can be done to deal with this threat? Sanctions, to the degree that they complicate Tehran's ability to procure equipment and special materials for its missile program, to include cruise missiles, are helpful, and they underscore Washington's commitment to addressing the threat, and they are an important element of U.S. policy. Washington should also continue to press allies, partners, and others, especially states that are members of the Missile Technology Control Regime, to tighten enforcement of export controls to prevent Iran from acquiring technology, equipment, and special materials that are essential to its missile program. The U.S. also needs to further strengthen its deterrent posture. To this end, it should continue to build up coalition missile defenses in the Middle East. After all, Iran's missile force is a problem to which there is a viable solution, albeit an extremely costly one. And it should continue to strengthen the ability of U.S. and partner nations to deliver long-range precision fires and conduct aerial strikes against Iranian missile bases and launchers to attrite Iran's missile forces left of launch. These capabilities also ensure that the U.S. and its partners have the ability to respond in kind to Iranian missile strikes. But the U.S. response must go beyond missiles. The United States needs a comprehensive strategy toward Iran that pushes back against destabilizing Iranian regional activities, strengthens the JCPOA, and deters Iran from building an industrial-scale nuclear infrastructure or attempting a nuclear breakout down the road. To this end, the United States should respond in a more assertive fashion to Iranian naval harassment in the Gulf, increase efforts to interdict Iranian arms transfers to regional proxies and partners, ramp up support for non-Salafist opposition groups in Syria, and commit to a long-term defense partnership with Iraq. The intent of these steps would be to restore Washington's credibility in Tehran and alter Iran's cost-benefit calculus vis-à-vis the United States, inducing it to greater caution in areas where the possibility of a conflict with the United States exists. As for the nuclear deal, it would be a mistake to tear it up. This would isolate the United States, further complicate the reimposition of sanctions should it prove necessary, and provide Iran with a pretext to resume formally prescribed nuclear activities. Rather, the U.S. should strictly enforce the JCPOA, try to redress its shortcomings, and maximize the productive use of the decade-plus bought by the agreement. One of the main flaws of U.S. policy towards Iran is that it pursued a time-buying approach, the JCPOA, without a strategy for how to use the time gained. The United States needs to put together such a strategy now by, first, addressing loopholes and shortcomings in the existing non-proliferation and safeguards regime, assembling a broad coalition to persuade Iran to forego its option to build an industrial-scale nuclear infrastructure once JCPOA-mandated restrictions are lifted after 15 years, and perhaps most importantly, leveraging the credibility conferred by its pushback against destabilizing Iranian regional policies to alter Tehran's nuclear risk calculus, thereby bolstering American ability to deter a future Iranian nuclear breakout. I look forward to discussing these matters with you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Rosenberg.
Thank you, Chair Ros-Lehtinen, Ranking Member Deutsch, distinguished members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today on the topic of Iran ballistic missile and IRGC sanctions. International sanctions on Iran's ballistic missile activities and the IRGC are an integral component to the broad-ranging and powerful financial measures that target and isolate Iran for its nefarious activities. They are at the heart of U.S. sanctions on Iran and set an appropriately aggressive tone for Washington.
Can you put the microphone just a little closer?
And they set an appropriately aggressive tone for Washington to pursue its interests with this destabilizing regime. Congress has provided critical leadership in this effort to target Iran's missile activity and the IRGC, and I applaud this important work. I encourage you to continue this attention to make it clear to Iran that while the international community has entered into a strong agreement with Iran over its nuclear program, U.S. policy leaders will aggressively hold Iran accountable for its threatening non-nuclear activities. The United States has imposed sanctions on the IRGC and Iran's ballistic missile activities specifically to highlight Iran's weapons proliferation, human rights abuses, including through cyber-enabled means, and in the case of the IRGC Quds Force, its support for terrorism. Even after the nuclear deal, of course, many sanctions on Iran's ballistic missiles development and the IRGC remain firmly in place. U.S. sanctions on Iran's ballistic missile activities seek to expose and counter the agencies and the entities that develop and deploy Iran's missile program, along with regional missile defense capabilities and the U.S. military's significant presence in the Middle East, as has been mentioned. They're an integral part of the United States' effort to deter Iran from using missiles to threaten its neighbors and to protect U.S. interests in the region. The Iranian missile arsenal is the largest and most lethal in the Middle East, and it's fundamental to the Iranian strategy to protect power and influence. Iran continues its dangerous and provocative missile tests, as you mentioned in your statement, in a show of force. However, the greatest threat in this arsenal presents is the potential for missiles to serve as delivery systems for nuclear weapons, of course. Financial sanctions imposed by the United States on the IRGC more broadly than just its missile program, target this proliferation activity and its human rights abuse, and in the case of the Quds Force, as I mentioned, its support for terrorism. These various sanctions are important, given the political prominence of the IRGC in Iran and in the Middle East, and its extensive role in a host of Iranian commercial sectors. However, they have a limited financial impact, given the relatively limited links between the U.S. and the Iranian economies, and the broad avoidance by Iranians of the U.S. dollar as a means to limit their sanctions exposure. Indeed, the IRGC has been able to function during the last several years of most severe international sanctions pressure on Iran before and leading up to implementation day for the nuclear deal. The United States has a variety of options to expand sanctions pressure on Iran's ballistic missile activities and the destabilizing and threatening role of the IRGC. First, the administration should go aggressively after implementing existing sanctions authorities, targeting Iran's ballistic missile procurement networks and the agencies responsible for development and deployment of the missile program. Second, the administration should immediately embark on a concerted and broad-ranging sanctions campaign to expose and target the dangerous and insidious activities of the IRGC within and beyond the borders of Iran, including exposing the financial activity and holdings of the IRGC, its agents and its instrumentalities, and regional terrorist proxies wherever feasible. The strongest and most successful approach to countering Iranian threats is through continued multilateral action. Where European sanctions on Iranian ballistic missiles and the IRGC do not match those of the United States, U.S. policymakers should strongly urge EU counterparts to align their financial measures. U.S. leaders should also work with UN member states to add new arms or missile proliferators to sanctions lists where there's sufficient information. Congressional leaders are well placed to outline the contours of such a strategy and to urge aggressive administration implementation. And congressional members can also set the right expectations for successful multilateral engagement, including renewed sanctions, pressure, and also a fresh look at force posture arrangements and intelligence and covert activities. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you to the three of you. Excellent testimony. Dr. Katzman, I'll begin with you. You stated in your written testimony that some are interpreting the JCPOA as essentially walling off core economic sectors in Iran, like energy, banking, manufacturing, from new sanctions. I believe that Iran's core economic sectors are absolutely eligible for impact by non-nuclear related sanctions under the JCPOA because the IRGC is in control of Iran's ballistic missile program as well as so much of Iran's economy. Any effective sanctions targeting the missile program will by necessity impact these core economic sectors. So do you believe that these economic sectors are walled off from non-nuclear sanctions?
Thank you, Congressman. The sanctions that were lifted basically were secondary U.S. sanctions that force major foreign corporations to choose between doing business in Iran with its major economic sectors or doing business in the United States. Those sanctions were lifted in concert with the JCPOA, and we've seen foreign corporations now return. Some of the big energy majors have returned and are talking about drilling for oil again. Iran's ships are patrolling the seas again, delivering oil. Iran's oil exports are back to where they were in 2011. Iran is back into the international banking system. It's been relinked to the SWIFT electronic payment system. So the Iranian economy has grown possibly as high as 6% in the 1 year since the sanctions were lifted. So without those sanctions, if those sanctions cannot be reimposed like that, it may be difficult to cause Iran to make the calculations on missiles or human rights or terrorism like was made when they accepted the JCPOA. Their economy was hurting so badly that they felt they had to accept the JCPOA. If you cannot reimpose those sanctions at that extensive level, they might not think twice about some of these other activities. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. And Mr. Eisenstadt, can you please outline for us the IRGC's involvement in Iran's economy? Which sectors does it have a stake in, and how are they connected to Iran's ballistic missile program, and how can our sanctions against the IRGC and Iran's missile program be more effective?
Yeah, I'll have to, Madam Chairperson, this is not an area that I'm really a specialist in, so I'll defer for the most part, except to say my understanding is that the IRGC has an involvement throughout just about every sector of the economy. They either have full ownership or partial ownership of firms throughout the economy. Many of them are in sectors that are important, that have a potential contribution to make to the missile program, whether it be related to heavy industry, mining, production of materials that are important potentially for the missile program. But showing the connection between those industries and the missile program, I think at least in the public domain, is a missing link, and I think therefore any designation of the missile, any new sanctions regarding the missile program that involves, that mandates reporting that exposes these connections, I think would be very helpful. So let me just say, my approach to sanctions on the missiles and Iran's missile program is to look at how we can disrupt their ability to acquire special materials, technology, and the like from overseas. And we see in pictures that they continue to publish of missile production facilities that they are getting production technology that they should not be getting under the MTCR, Missile Technology Control Regime. So clearly some of our allies have more work to do in terms of tightening their export controls. So there's more work to be done in that area.
I don't know if Ms. Rosenberg or Dr. Katzman wanted to.
I'd be happy to speak to that, to this question, as well as to the question you posed to Mr. Katzman.
Yes, please.
I would like to affirm your interpretation of the JCPOA, which I also agree does not preclude the United States from pursuing sanctions on pursuant to non-nuclear areas of its concern with regard to Iranian behavior. So should there be an entity that is engaged in significant acts of support for terrorism or regional destabilization, I believe that the United States can and should pursue sanctions against such entities. That's different from going after sectors of the Iranian economy, which were broadly delisted in the nuclear agreement. Speaking to the areas of the economy in which the IRGC is involved, they are reported to be quite extensive: heavy industry, engineering, construction, energy, shipping. However, as was mentioned, it's difficult to trace the beneficial ownership link between the IRGC and many of its entities in the Iranian economy for various reasons, but such legal requirements for disclosure of this corporate information are not very good in Iran. In fact, that's been pointed out by professional institutions in the financial services sector. So one of the most effective ways that the United States can go after the IRGC for its concerns relating to the IRGC have to do with identifying further agents, entities, companies, fronts, commanders, and business executives in these companies in the economy that work on behalf of the IRGC.
Thank you, Ms. Rosenberg. Dr. Katzman, you wanted to comment on that?
I would just comment, one of the biggest construction companies in Iran is called Khatem al-Anbiya, which means seal of the prophet. It's called Gorb. It is a designated sanctioned entity. It is very large, thousands of employees. It was started by the IRGC. In fact, it grew out of the IRGC's like their Army Corps of Engineers. It was the IRGC's construction wing during the Iran-Iraq War, and then it was spun off as essentially a construction company. It is very large, and it is a designated entity, and it is sanctioned, yes.
Thank you very much. Mr. Deutsch?
Thanks, Madam Chairman. Dr. Katzman, do you want to just continue with that? So it's already sanctioned, and so what more can be done with a huge entity like that?
Well, I mean, I think the point is, we delist when the JCPOA was implemented last January 2016, hundreds of entities were delisted from U.S. sanctions. In other words, they were no longer subject to U.S. sanctions. But these were mainly, again, as I mentioned, energy companies, shipping insurance, banks, the central bank, Iran Air, Iran's civilian economy delisted. The IRGC-related companies like Gorb, other IRGC affiliates, missile entities, anything to do with terrorism, IRGC commanders, I mean, hundreds of entities remain designated for sanctions. And it's in these areas, proliferation, terrorism, human rights, but the civilian economy, Iran's civilian economy, the energy sector, banking, what I mentioned, transportation, sanctions were lifted, and under the JCPOA, Iran has said that if the sanctions that were lifted are reimposed, Iran would consider that a breach and it would cease implementing its commitments. So, for example, if Iran's central bank were again sanctioned to the extent that it was cut off from the international banking system, I think I have a lot of confidence in saying Iran would say the deal is finished.
Right, even if the sanctions had nothing to do with proliferation activities.
Correct. The language in the JCPOA is sanctions that were lifted cannot be reimposed for other justifications, non-nuclear. In other words, terrorism, human rights, these other things cannot be reimposed under other justifications. Right.
I wanted to just follow up on the concept of multilateral sanctions, which are still, I think, the best approach. And the frustration of the Security Council to act against the ballistic missile tests. This has now gone on in 2 administrations, and we raised the test at the Council, and Russia and China play lawyer for Iran and argue that the tests aren't prohibited under 2231. So if UN sanctions aren't an option, what about the EU? And what's the best argument for our EU allies that adopting strong sanctions, ballistic missile sanctions, aren't just of paramount importance to international security, but that they also don't violate the deal? At a time, we should point out, when the EU is interested in vigorously enforcing the deal, at least to ensure that the deal remains in place. Hey, Ms. Rosenberg.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I think there's a lot of running room for the United States to work with the EU on sanctions and on further sanctions concerning the IRGC, for example. The EU targets the IRGC under its own sanctions, and some of those remain in place still. While it is difficult for the UN Security Council, for a number of reasons I mentioned already this afternoon, to go after these Iranian missile tests and call them a violation, that it doesn't meet the test of the language in the UN Security Council resolution, and furthermore, to the extent that Iran has
They argue that it doesn't meet the test.
Correct.
That's
right.
the role they play.
Right. So if it's difficult to find violation at that level, then surely the United States and Europe can move forward further here. I think for the United States, offering leadership by designating additional fronts in the network, the procurement network related to the ballistic missile program, and asking, working with the EU to share information and asking them to match these sanctions in the EU by the EU Commission is a perfectly viable, reasonable, and important strategy for the U.S. to take.
Okay, thanks. Mr. Eisenstadt.
If I could just add, the Islamic Republic has itself said that the UN Security Council resolution is something separate than the nuclear deal, and they don't consider it binding. We should say, well, you know, if we are trying to argue for our allies to join us on sanctions related to the missiles, we should say that, look, the Islamic Republic itself says that this is not part of the deal, and therefore they should not be, you know, this should not be a consideration with regard to our allies. And we're also, we share concern with regard to freedom of navigation in the Gulf and the security of the Gulf, and this impinges on that. So I think we have a good argument to make with regard to our European partners.
And Madam Chairman, if I could just ask one other question, and that's in order to weaken the IRGC's involvement in terrorism, we have to cut off their access to Hezbollah. And the concern that I know we all share is that as long as Russia continues to turn a blind eye to what Iran is doing in Syria, it makes that really difficult. So Rouhani was just in Moscow this week. Russia, it seems, has accomplished its goal in Syria of being firmly entrenched now in the Middle East, but it continues to aid Iran not just in Syria, but in the uranium sale, the S-300 sale, for reasons that appear to be only to serve their own self-interest or being bulwarks against the United States. The question I would just put out to you is if the United States, as the President has now told us repeatedly, wants closer cooperation with Russia, how do we get tough with Iran at the same time? I didn't mean to stump you. Yes, Ms. Rosenberg.
I don't think that these necessarily must be inconsistent. And whether you appreciate or not the example of the previous administration, there was a demonstration of, on the one hand, working in coordination with Russia and the UN process for around the nuclear deal, and working aggressively with Russia when it came to application of new sanctions with regard to its activities in Ukraine. There's no reason why there cannot similarly be a variegated strategy under this administration, which could seek to coordinate with Russia as appropriate, perhaps on Syria-related issues, and push back more firmly, in this case, with regard to support for Iran's ballistic missile program.
Right, and Iran's support of Hezbollah
Absolutely.
in Syria.
If I could just add on that, I mean, we have worked with them productively in the past with regard to, say, for instance, the S-300 missiles, delaying the delivery of those for quite some time. The problem is, I think, given the current trajectory of U.S.-Russian relations, and the fact also, as I just want to add, there is probably some daylight between Russia's position towards the conflict in Syria and Iran's position. But given the general trajectory of U.S.-Russian relations, I think it will be increasingly difficult in the future because of all the stuff that's going on with regard to hacking and Ukraine and the like. It'll be increasingly difficult to find areas to cooperate on. But in principle, it is a possibility.
If I can just add, my assessment, it is going to be extremely difficult to get Iran and Hezbollah to be separated. Iran sees Hezbollah as the most prominent outgrowth of the Islamic Revolution of 1979. Iran will do anything to defend Hezbollah. I would argue Iran is in Syria in a big way because it wants to protect that weapons channel to Hezbollah. The IRGC created Hezbollah's military wing. The Quds Force grew out of the IRGC's contingent that went to Lebanon to create Hezbollah's military wing. The connection between Iran and Hezbollah is organic. It would take a tremendous heavy lift to separate these two entities, in my estimation.
Great answer. Questions. Thank you so much, Mr. Deutsch. Mr. Master, Florida.
Yeah, Mr. Eisenstadt, you spoke in your written testimony about the way Hamas and Hezbollah used their rockets against Israel, and that is a useful template for what could happen in the future. And I wanted to start with something backing up a little bit before that. To what would you attribute this? You know, the United States of America mastered this ballistic technology in the 50s, 60s. China did as well. You know, Russia, 50s, 60s, 70s. What would you provide the greatest attribution to say, this far in the future, 2017, Iran still hasn't mastered that? Why would you say they still haven't mastered that?
One thing that we, I think, often underestimate is exactly how hard it is to even create technologies that we developed in the 40s and the 50s for many developing countries today. And so many proliferators are in some ways along the, if you look at in terms of the proliferation timeline, in terms of their capabilities, they are, still in the 40s in many ways. But you know what, to use a term that my friend Peter Zimmerman coined, while pursuing bronze medal technology, from their point of view and in terms of their needs, it's good enough. Because we've seen time and again that even Hamas, with rockets made in home kind of garage, workshops, until the Israelis deployed the Iron Dome, were able to terrorize populations in southern Israel and to harass these people and cause casualties. So now with the development of Israeli missile defenses, they've developed the ability, at least in theory and in practice, to intercept these capabilities. But the Iranians are producing them in such numbers, and they're cheap relative to the price of defenses, that they have the ability to saturate defenses. And the Israelis are developing a layered approach, that they have the low-end capabilities now with Iron Dome, they have high-end with the Arrow. In the middle range, they're developing David Sling and deploying it this year. But most of Hamas.
To pause you, are you saying that it was, basically pure dumb luck or a lack of intelligence on their part that didn't get them to this point yet? What about what we've done in modern history, prior to the JCPOA, has prevented them to getting to this point? Prior to that, what prevented them from getting this, or even talking about proliferation? The first nuclear weapon, we didn't even have to test Trinity. We knew if you fire one piece of fissile material into another, you're going to get a critical mass. Yeah. We didn't have to test it. What has prevented them, previous to the JCPOA, to getting to that point?
It's a combination of efforts to disrupt what they were doing by us, arms control, export control regimes, efforts to try to prevent the spread of this information, although now this stuff is pretty much out there. But it's one thing to know it, it's another thing to actually be able to apply it in practice, and you need to have a very large human manpower base, human capital base that is capable of handling complex projects and integrating all the different aspects of it. And we often underestimate how difficult it is. How many countries in the world produce fighter jets? Or even cars. Iran does produce cars now, but for many years it was kind of knockdown kits that they imported from Peugeot or whatever. So we often underestimate how difficult it is, these kind of complex industrial tasks. So a lot of it is just that it's extremely hard. We've been doing it for so long, we have what people call tacit knowledge, because we have a lot of people who've learned how to do this kind of thing. But if you're starting from scratch, it's very difficult to be able to master the full range of capabilities needed for a robust ballistic missile program.
Where would you say access to the world market puts them in terms of advancing towards what they've yet been able to master?
Well, it's very important.
China, Russia, U.S., a number of other countries.
Yeah, it's very important, because in the 90s, they benefited from Russian help in terms of individuals who were formerly associated with Russia's missile programs. Their Shahab-3 missile was based on the North Korean Nodong. So they've gotten help from the North Koreans, the Russians, and also China was involved in their solid fuel rocket program. So they've benefited from foreign assistance, and they probably still do. Every program around the world has benefited from foreign assistance, but they've reached a point now where they've in some ways surpassed their former teachers in North Korea, and they are generally considered to be more capable in this area than the North Koreans in most areas in the missile realm. But they've, getting know-how and materials from abroad is still very important for their program. And there's some areas where I think they will continue to benefit. For instance, penetration aids and countermeasures. which, as far as we know, they don't really put on their missiles yet. That's the next step, and that will make missile defense much harder if they're able to jam and put out countermeasures to the missile defenses.
Sure, we didn't get into MERV or anything else, but my time has expired,
Yeah.
so.
Thank you, Mr. Mast. I'll follow up with some of your questions. Mr. Swazi.
You got it.
I've got a really difficult name, so I hope you don't get insulted by Swazi.
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 Suazzi in Italian.
Swazi, thank you.
Madam Chair, I want to thank you very much for your leadership here, as well as the ranking member. I want to thank the witnesses for their thoughtful insight and analysis. It really is a great education that you're giving us here today. I think that there's broad agreement in this room that there's a serious problem with Iran's ballistic missile program and that something has to be done. It's a question of what's the proper authority and how are we going to do it and who are our partners going to be in that process. But I think that there's a broad agreement. I want to ask a question about timing. The elections are coming up in Iran in May, and I'd like to just hear the benefit of your analysis regarding the politics of Iran and how the President, Rouhani, and the Supreme Leader and the IRGC and all the different players that are involved here, the regular military. Just tell me a little bit about the intersection of all of them and then how what we do could or could not affect that outcome.
I'll start with that. The regular military that existed under the Shah, it is still there. It does not interfere in politics at all. In fact, during the uprising of 2009, the regular military issued a letter saying, do not ask us to go repress these demonstrators. So they are not a factor. Now, the IRGC, as I said in my statement, is a factor.
The regular military reports to the civilian president?
It reports up to a general headquarters that reports to the Supreme Leader, actually.
To the Supreme Leader, okay.
Yes, the Supreme Leader is technically the commander-in-chief of the whole armed forces, right. The IRGC does interfere in politics, and they've done so on several occasions. In fact, it was widely reported, and there seems to be agreement that it did put Mr. Ahmadinejad over the top in 2005. He came out of nowhere, but the IRGC deployed the besieged. They leafleted for him. They drove people to the polls, and they view it as their mission to interfere in politics, to defend the revolution. Now, I think most experts, and I would say I'm in this camp too, thinks that if it's a free and fair election, Mr. Rouhani is the favorite. He ran on a platform of delivering Iran from its international isolation. He negotiated the JCPOA. He did bring them to some extent out of their isolation. So he did. The people that voted for him in 2013 seem to probably vote for him again. Now, the issue is the hardliners. There was some thinking earlier on that the hardliners would maybe just not even contest it so much, but no, they seem to be organizing. They're trying to unify around one conservative hardline candidate to oppose him.
Who is that?
Well, they have not. They're having some caucuses. For the first time, they're actually having some meetings to try to vote on one unified candidate. The issue is there is one particular figure who the Supreme Leader favors a lot, who they might choose, and that would be significant because if this individual runs, the regime might be tempted to try to, let's say, interfere on his behalf, to put it mildly. He is the leader of the Quds Rastavi Foundation in Mashhad. Khamenei appointed him last summer. And Khamenei appears to favor him as the next Supreme Leader. So engineering him to the presidency would give him an advantage to be the next Supreme Leader.
If I could take a...
Does it help? I'm sorry. Does it help or hurt for us to do something before May?
You mean in terms of sanctions? Well, probably the hardliners, the Supreme Leader, they have been criticizing Rouhani to some extent that they're saying he has not delivered all the promises of sanctions relief. It is possible that new action could...
I'm running out of time. Mr. Eisenstadt, go ahead.
I'll just be quick. Iranian domestic politics has its own internal logic, and our ability to influence it in ways that redounds to the benefit of American policy has generally worked out just the opposite that we had hoped. And I would just say we could probably do a lot to hurt things, but it's not a lot we can do to help the people that we want to help. President Khatami, when he was elected in '97, we had hopes that this would herald a change. He was undercut by his domestic opponents. President Bush wanted regime change, but the people didn't rise up. They rose up in 2009 when we had a president who wanted to engage the regime there. And with the JCPOA, we were hoping that the nuclear agreement would lead to a broad, a general improvement in the relations between the two countries. But what we've seen is, in fact, it's probably emboldened those who are against the improvement of relations. So our ability to game this in a way to advance our goals has shown to be very limited, if non-existent. But there is things we can do that could harm things if we act in a heavy-handed way sometimes. But often we can't really help the people we want to help usually.
I'll just be very brief in responding to this. I think I would like to agree with the comments just made by my colleague, Dr. Eisenstadt, that in fact it's very difficult for U.S. policymakers to specifically engineer particular political outcomes in Iran. We should be very humble about that. I don't think that undertaking sanctions enforcement using existing authorities will meaningfully sway Iranian politics. It doesn't actually change the broader U.S. posture or the set of authorities that are in place. Nevertheless, there's no specific need to do something now versus 60 or 90 days from now, absent a particular provocation against which the U.S. should push back. So there's plenty of opportunities. The United States has an ability to use them whenever it wants.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. Excellent questions and answers. And now we turn to Ms. Wagner, Ambassador Wagner.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Eisenstadt, the rules of Iranian cyber warfare seem to deviate, I think, from the codes that guide the world's 5 cyber powers, the US, UK, Russia, China, and Israel. Iranian hackers do not just engage in espionage and gather intelligence, they try to do harm. And there were some reports last spring that there had been a lull in Iranian cyber activity since the nuclear deal. Can you discuss, to the best of your ability, how Iranian cyber strategy has shifted in the wake of the nuclear deal and how Iran will use destructive cyber capabilities in the future?
Yeah, a lot of this will be necessarily speculative. My understanding is that after the end of during the negotiation of the JCPOA, they actually held in abeyance a lot of their offensive cyber activities. After its conclusion, my understanding is that they resumed a lot of their net reconnaissance activities. In other words, they were kind of snooping around to try to gather information about critical infrastructure in the United States and elsewhere, both probably to send a signal that they have the capability to harm us in this domain in the future should the relations deteriorate, and also to build up, their kind of targeting, folders. For cyber targeting folders. And a lot of this also involved collection of, cyber phishing activities against personnel involved in American Iran policy and the like. There were also some attacks directed against Saudi Arabia over the winter, which probably are related to the worsening or the downturn in relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So some of their activities, from Iran's point of view, a lot of their activities are in response to aggressive action either by the United States and Israel, for instance, with regard to Stuxnet,
right.
Or other activities that were done, for instance, the sanctions against their financial sector. So they attacked our financial sector with denials of service activities. And likewise, they engaged in attacks on Saudi Aramco and Qatar's Rasgas, in response to our sanctions on their oil industry a few years ago. So from their point of view, a lot of it has been defensive thus far, but I have no doubt that if there was a kind of deterioration in relations with Iran, from their point of view, we live in a cyber glass house. We have massive critical infrastructure, which right now we don't have the ability to protect. Their capabilities are not advanced. They're kind of a third-tier cyber power, but I think they have great potential in this area.
Thank
So
you.
this is an area which in the future I think will be much more important for them. Right now, there's not probably, they could be a nuisance at this time, and perhaps more.
I have great concerns about a future and where we may be going with this. Moving on, it seems that Erdogan has long been loath to criticize Iranian ballistic missile and nuclear programs. The complicated relationship between Turkey and Iran has become more concerning with the Moscow Declaration and the trial of Turkish-Iranian sanctions buster Reza Zarrab in New York. Ms. Rosenberg, given the arrest of Turkish sanctions busters in the U.S. and the information that courts may uncover, do you think we'll find that the Turkish elite have extensive Iranian ties?
Ties to Iran or ties to sanctions evasion?
Yes.
That's a subject that's been one of great concern and focus for U.S. policy leaders, for the U.S. intelligence community, and there's been quite a lot of investigation into this, appropriately so, given economic linkages and also political ties. There has not been this, and I should say that Turkey is not singled out in this category. There are other jurisdictions where linkages between high-level officials and economic linkages put.
But you would say there are ties there.
There are links, and the concern is that they may be more insidious than merely political or commercial ties could suggest.
Interesting. Okay, so Mr. Eisenstadt, in my short time here, or others on the panel, to what extent does Iranian money fund terror groups operating inside of Turkey?
I'll defer to my colleagues. I don't follow Turkey very closely, so I'll defer to others on this.
You're talking about the Kurdish
yes.
Groups. The IRGC has some relation with the Iraqi Kurds. The PKK, not sure, not really a close connection there.
Ms. Rosenberg, I know my time is up.
I have nothing further to add.
Okay. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you so much, Ms. Wagner. You make a valuable contribution to our subcommittee. Mr. Kinzinger, thank you for your service also on our sub and to our nation.
It's good to be back. Thanks. And thank you all for being here. Obviously, I think it comes as no surprise. I thought the JCPOA was a pretty bad deal. And I think it really just provides, as we look at it, a roadmap for a timeline and how to acquire nuclear weapons eventually. And when it comes to playing the long game, I think Iran is okay with saying we can have weapons in 10 or 15 years, or the threat of weapons is almost in many cases as good as having them. But I also think now, obviously, we're in a situation where to redevelop, despite the discussion of snapback provisions and sanctions, which we knew would never happen, being able to develop a coalition of people to re-engage Iran through that, it'd be difficult. But I think we have to watch this JCPOA like a hawk and be ready to fight back against any violations and push back against ballistic missile technology. I also think, when you look at Iran, and it's not just what is happening in Yemen, I think what is extremely important is what is happening in Syria. And you look at the Bashar al-Assad, who I actually believe created ISIS, not necessarily by signing on the dotted line somewhere, but by creating an environment where it's easy to recruit and to dash ISIS from. And so I believe that Iran bears some responsibility for the existence of ISIS. Now, I also want to say I'm co-chair of the Iraq Caucus, and obviously an Iraq veteran myself. And when I was in Iraq, we saw the role of Iran in Iraq very, very closely. We know that hundreds of Americans died as a result of Iran's involvement in Iraq, and we know that in fact the incoming Iranian ambassador is a senior IRGC official. So we can only estimate what that means. We cannot allow Iran to continue to destabilize Iraq. So in addition to sanctions, Mr. Eisenstadt, how would you advise the administration to counter Tehran's influence in Iraq?
Thank you. First thing I would recommend is that we commit to make it clear to the Iraqis, and let me just say, the Iraqi government, both the current government and even the previous government under Nouri al-Maliki, have always wanted to maintain a balance between the United States and Iran, and indicating to them that we want to maintain a long-term security relationship with them, as well as a relationship in other areas. We'll make it clear to them that they will have the ability to continue with that policy. We have to recognize, because of proximity, they have to make their peace with the Iranians and live with a certain degree of influence that many Iraqis feel uncomfortable. But making it clear that we want a long-term security relationship with them is the first part of that. I think committing to a long-term training relationship with the Iraqi armed forces. I mean, one of the things that's come through with this campaign in Mosul is that it was basically, while in the early days after June 2014, the Popular Mobilization Forces were very important for breaking the advance of ISIL, the conventional military forces have been key to pushing them back in most places. No. And I think we can make a very convincing case to the Iraqi government that you need to continue building up your conventional security forces, and we're really the ideal partner to do that.
Right.
Iran can't help you there. So there's things we can do, I think, in this regard to continue to ensure that Iraq knows that we want this relationship, and they'll be able to push back.
And that's important to note too. Is the Iraqi military can be fully capable, but they need the American military to stiffen their spine, at least for now. And we see obviously that was important in the fight against Daesh. Ms. Rosenberg, I want to ask you about Syria. Again, 500,000 dead Syrians, almost 50,000 of which are children. You're watching Iran use, I think, money from sanction relief to prop up that regime. And unfortunately, around the world, there's kind of this belief now that it's either Bashar al-Assad or it's terrorism. And I don't think people recognize that, in fact, Assad's creating the next generation of terrorists right now that we'll end up having to fight by taking away opportunity and freedom for people. But specifically, when I talk about the sanctions relief and the money, do you know if there's any way that we can track how much that money is being used in Iran, and if they're using that to fund genocides, what kind of action can we take to punish them?
Thank you for the question. It's difficult, as I think you're indicating, to track exactly where Iran's money that was unfrozen after the nuclear deal is going or is flowing specifically. That's true for a number of reasons. Two key ones are that if we're talking about state revenues, that it goes into a state budget and can be allocated as under the design of the state. So there's not a transaction chain to follow if it were going through independent institutions that have that must use private banking channels, et cetera. Another significant reason that it's difficult to understand exactly where it's flowing is because Iran has ample reason to keep that money outside of its own jurisdiction and not to repatriate it and then to hand it over, in this instance, to President Assad in terms of cash or material support, using this to defend its currency, using it to balance international trade. Iran still struggles for access to hard currency, so there's quite ample reason for it to use this for what is essentially the civilian economy. There are great needs there in order to deliver economic relief to the population, which was a mandate, of course, of President Rouhani as part of this deal and following on.
All right, thank you. And with that, I'll yield back.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kinzinger. And Mr. Schneider of Illinois, thank you.
Thank you. And again, thank you to the witnesses for your testimony. Dr. Katzman, in your opening statement, you talked a bit about Iran's calculus and trying to change their calculus. And if I think about math briefly, on the right-hand side of the equation are goals and objectives for Iran. Broadly speaking, that's preserving the regime and maintaining their influence. On the left-hand side of that equation are factors they control and factors they don't control. Hopefully we can. And I'll open this up to everybody. What are the factors post or within the context of the JCPOA, within the context of what's happening in Syria, in Yemen, and around the region, with broad context of what's happening in our country and around the world? What can we do to change that calculus, and what do we have to understand about Iran's thinking to know which levers to pull or which buttons to push?
I would just start by saying, Iran's calculus is multifaceted in the region. As I said in my statement, Iran views the Middle East as controlled basically by the United States, Israel, and Saudi Arabia. That's how they think, which is a power structure in Iran's view that is weighted against Shia, against Islamist parties, against anyone that's not part of the dominant elite. So they've chosen to intervene in a number of places to protect national interests, to protect their allies, to protect favored parties. And what is really needed is a multifaceted approach. Obviously, I think if all the conflicts that we see going in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq were ended, then Iran might not have rationale to be intervening as it is.
I suspect they would find other rationales there.
Possibly.
Mr. Eisenstadt, your thoughts?
Yeah. I just want to build on Ken's comments before about Iran and Hezbollah. I agree that we probably can't separate Iran from Hezbollah, but we haven't increased costs for Iran for its involvement in Syria. Our train and equip program with the Syrian opposition in the past was really not a serious effort. It may be too late now for us to mount a serious effort, but I would argue that we need to find people among the non-Salafist opposition to arm, both in order to ensure that areas where there are ceasefires remain ceasefires, because if the regime is able to build up its strength, it won't keep the ceasefires over time. And in areas where there aren't ceasefires and the regime continues to fight, we increase the costs for them and their allies, which includes the Iranians. And if this becomes a long-term quagmire for Iran, which this may be something which we don't have the ability to do now, but if we were able to do that, we might also be able to drive a wedge between Iran and Russia. Because I don't think Russia has, I think, different interests in Syria than the Iranians do. So, but we need to have a cost-imposing strategy in Syria, which we've not really tried until now, and I would hope this current administration might consider that going forward.
And I want to come to you, Ms. Rosenberg, in a second, but Mr. Eisenstadt, as you talked about Hezbollah, is it fair to say that that HIFPA, the Hezbollah International Financing Prevention Act, has had an impact on Hezbollah's ability to act in the region, or are there more things we can do around that as well?
Yeah, my understanding, it has had a major impact, but perhaps not on their ability to act in the region, because I think in terms of prioritizing monies, you know, from their point of view, their activities in Syria and elsewhere is existential from their point of view. And if they have less money for social services and to provide to their base, well, in terms of guns and butter, they put the money goes to the guns and not the butter at this point. But in the long term, that could have an impact in terms of how their domestic support base, looks at them if they can't benefit from this in the future.
Ms. Rosenberg.
I would just add briefly to that, in addition to raising the costs, I think that creating greater leverage for the United States and other international allies can be cultivated by further exposing Iran's dangerous activities or naked violations of arms restrictions, for example. What I'm talking about here is using sanctions as a means to expose particular violations or circumvention activities, doing more public interdiction of weapons for Houthis or to terrorist proxies in the Middle East, and again through possibly U.S. force posture and projection in the Middle East by identifying incidences where Iran is engaged in threatening behavior, saber rattling in the Gulf and in the Straits.
Great. Thank you. With that, my time is all but expired. I'll yield back.
Thank you so much, Mr. Schneider. And now, Mr. Connolly of Virginia.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thanks so much for pulling this together. Wonderful panel, and I wish we had lots of time with each one of you because I've enjoyed listening to the testimony and watching it. And I'm going to go kind of rapid fire. Bear with me because I only got 5 minutes, and this chairman's tight, All right.
All the time.
So, Ms. Rosenberg, you answered Mr. Deutsch's question about the apparent incompatibility of the Trump administration's desire for a rapprochement with Russia with Iranian threats. You said these don't need to be inconsistent, and I want to give you a chance to explain that because, to me, this prima facie evidence they are inherently inconsistent. I mean, their support for Houthis, their support for Hezbollah, their support for Assad, these are all goals antithetical to U.S. policy that has not changed with the new administration that I'm aware of. What did you mean they don't need to be inconsistent? How could they be otherwise? And I'm not trying to challenge you. I wanted to give you an opportunity to clarify.
Sure. What I meant was that the U.S. posture towards Russia need not be inconsistent, that there could be both a cooperation in certain domains and a tough pushback in others.
Even where we disagree?
Correct.
Got it. Okay. That's what you meant.
Yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Katzman, how important do you believe in resolving all of these issues ultimately? What's going on in Yemen, the civil war in Syria, and other tension in the region? I could go down the laundry list, but how important at the end of the day will diplomacy be as part of the solution?
Well, actually, it was tried.
Could you speak up?
I'm sorry, it was tried.
Perfect.
After the JCPOA, there was, in fact, an effort to enlist Iran to try to get...
No, I'm talking about our diplomacy.
Well, the U.S. tried to... We were talking with the Iranians after the JCPOA was finalized to get them to be helpful on Syria. It did not succeed. The JCPOA still went forward, but that did not succeed because Iran's interests were just completely different. They need Assad there because he's allowing this channel for Iran to support Hezbollah, which is their most cherished goal. So the Iranians did not cooperate. We tried diplomacy, and it did not succeed in that particular example.
Fair enough, but although that kind of goes back to Ms. Rosenberg's point, we agree on some things, we're going to disagree on other. It really depends on what's in someone's perceived national interest. Apparently, Iran perceived that a nuclear agreement was in its interest.
They absolutely did.
As did we and the other world powers.
The sanctions drove them into what we hear. If it had done that much damage to our economy, it was on the line of the Great Depression here. Absolutely.
And thank you. Very good point. And that allows me to segue, Mr. Eisenstadt, and you can come in as well. How efficacious will sanctions be, can they be, on the issue of ballistic missiles and other unacceptable behavior by Iran? It seemed to work on the nuclear front. Will it work here?
Yeah, I think the case of the nuclear sanctions are kind of sui generis at this point. And I think the best we could hope for is kind of incremental benefits, disrupting their efforts to acquire technology, know-how, and the like, small wins, if you will. And it's the kind of thing that I don't think we ever, whereas the JCPOA gave us, if it works as intended, perhaps 15 years of respite in which we could use the time to perhaps change Iran's nuclear calculus. With the missiles, it's going to be an ongoing kind of thing of small victories at best.
And when you said sui generis, part of that is we actually had, mirabile dictu, the cooperation of Russia and China and France.
Exactly.
And on ballistic missiles and other behavior, we clearly will not.
Yes, I agree, yes.
Very good point. Either one of you, Ms. Rosenberg or Dr. Katzman, want to comment on that?
Sure, I would just...
Because Congress, this is very relevant to us, as the chairman knows, because we are, as we speak, looking at new additional sanctions legislation.
Sure, I would add that...
if you could speak into that microphone like Dr. Katzman did.
In addition to sanctions that can and should be part of the strategy, I certainly agree that as a kind of creation of leverage or means to cultivate U.S. For deterrence for Iran, these are small by comparison to a conventional deterrence force, which underscores the point that sanctions must be part of a broader, more holistic strategy of alliance politics and operational activities, as well as conventional defenses, not to mention cyber activity, covert activity, and this body, Congress, is well positioned to oversee not just sanctions, of course, but these other realms as well, particularly force structure and appropriations.
Madam Chairman, if you just allow Dr. Katzman to respond, and then I will yield back. I thank the chair.
Well, I would say that...
You got to speak in the microphone again, Dr. Katzman.
I sort of lost my train of thought.
Sorry, I would say, you started to say.
What was the question again? I'm sorry.
I think you were about to say, I would say that was a brilliant question, Congressman Conley, and God, I wish this hearing had been having more like that, something like that. No, that wasn't it. I was trying to help you here.
I mean, I would say sanctions were effective in getting the JCPOA because they affected Iran's core economic, its economy, its entire civilian economy.
And as
to work at the margins, to have other sanctions that are only going to nibble at the margins of Iran's economy are not likely to affect Iran's calculations.
Would you agree with Mr. Eisenstadt that in some ways the sanctions with respect to the nuclear development program were sui generis?
Yes.
And therefore unlikely to be replicated for anything else?
Well, if the new administration decides that it's going to implement the JCPOA, Iran is very clear that if the sanctions that were lifted are reimposed under other justifications, Iran is going to walk away from the deal. Iran is very clear on that.
Well, and let me just say, there are many of us up here who support the JCPOA, who believe fervently the JCPOA is working, that as a matter of fact, the existential threat to Israel was denial of JCPOA, not approval, and will not support sanctions that encroach on JCPOA. That we won't do. I'm more than willing to look at sanctions in the other venues, but I always worry with respect to sanctions about efficacy. And that's why I take what Mr. Eisenstadt said seriously. It doesn't mean don't do it, but if we're going to do it, it can't just be a feel-good, symbolic kind of thing. It has to be towards some end, a change in behavior. And that was the nature of my question.
Well, let me just give you, the sanctions Iran was exporting 2.6 million barrels a day of oil. When the sanctions kicked in, Iran was reduced to 1 million barrels a day, 60% decrease. Unless that is replicated, that is what caused, that type of diminishment is what caused Iran to make a new calculation.
Yep.
Unless you can replicate that, it's going to be very difficult to get Iran to make a new calculation.
Excellent point. And we even got nations like India to agree, and think about this, to reduce Iran as a supplier of something they don't really produce. That's a big hardship. And to get that level of cooperation takes a lot of diplomatic and other skills. And I take Mr. Eisenstadt's point, not so easy to replicate that for other things. We can try, but that's going to be a bigger challenge. Mr. Eisenstadt.
Can I make just one more point also? Depending on how U.S. relations with Russia and China evolve, even if Iran was to violate its JCPOA commitments, I'm not sure we'd even be able to snap back a few years from now, depending on politics. The stars all aligned in the last couple of years to enable JCPOA and the sanctions, and politics might evolve in a certain way that it may not be possible in the future, even for nuclear violations.
Madam Chairman, you've been very indulgent, and I really appreciate it, but I think this is a really important discussion. Thank you for pulling this
Thank you,
here.
and you're right, and especially in terms of new legislation that is building up in Congress. Thank you, Mr. Connolly, as always, and thank you to our witnesses. And with that, our subcommittee is adjourned. Thank you.